So things are heating up, and they're heating up in the worst way possible for Donald Trump. Let's hope they're also heating up in the best way possible for we the people, for accountability, for the rule of law, and for the future of our democracy. Let's talk about that, because justice matters. Hey all, Glenn Kirshner here. So we have a lot to talk about, but let me state this plainly. There have been dramatic new developments regarding the federal criminal investigation into Donald Trump. Now, I'm not prepared to say next stop justice, but there are several data points that spell real trouble for Trump. We've got to start with the new Blockbuster reporting from the Washington Post by reporter Carol Leonnig, and there are several other reporters on the byline. Headline: Justice Department investigating Trump's actions in January 6 criminal probe. And that article begins, the Justice Department is investigating President Donald Trump's actions as part of its criminal probe of efforts to overturn the 2020 election results, according to 4 people familiar with the matter. Prosecutors who are questioning witnesses before a grand jury, including 2 top aides to Vice President Mike Pence, have asked in recent days about conversations with Trump, his lawyers, and others in his inner circle who sought to substitute Trump allies for certified electors from some states Joe Biden won. That's the so-called fake elector scheme. Now, I want to quote something that Washington Post reporter Carol Leonnig said this morning on MSNBC. She was sort of putting some meat on the bones of her reporting regarding 2 witnesses who appeared before the grand jury. Mark Short, Vice President Mike Pence's former chief of staff, and Greg Jacobs, one of Pence's lawyers. Here's what Carol Leonnig said today on MSNBC. Quote, the questions that individuals are receiving in the grand jury are overwhelmingly, again and again, about what did Donald Trump say? What did Donald Trump do then? What did Donald Trump say to the vice president? And what did Donald Trump ask his lawyers to do for him? Those kind of questions, Carol Leonnig continued, if they were asked in an FBI investigation, could be a fishing expedition, could be a search just for basic information, but when asked in a grand jury, they indicate the prosecutors are preparing for the possibility, the potentiality of bringing charges and going to trial. They are more serious. It's not fishing. It's trying to get people on the record in a formal way that can be usable at trial. Now, Carol Leonnig really did my job for me there as not only a reporter but a legal analyst, and she's dead on. I can tell you from having spent countless hours before grand juries in Washington, D.C., in high-profile cases, when we're questioning important witnesses, we don't typically go on fishing expeditions. We have carefully vetted lines of questions. So when federal prosecutors are in the grand jury asking witnesses like Mark Short and Greg Jacob, what did Trump say next? Who did Trump talk to? What did Trump tell others to do? What did he say to Vice President Mike Pence? What did Donald Trump say to his lawyers? That's not casual, not cavalier, not reckless, not spur of the moment. That is a rock-solid indicator that Donald Trump is being criminally investigated in the grand jury. So the next question might be, how does Carol Leonnig know what prosecutors are asking of witnesses in the grand jury? Isn't the grand jury a secret proceeding? It is. Let me explain. So in my decades as a prosecutor, I spent countless hours before grand juries in Washington, D.C. And yes, grand jury proceedings are secret by law. I am not permitted, I was never permitted to talk about what went on in the grand jury room once I left the grand jury. I couldn't even confirm or deny that a particular witness appeared before the grand jury. I was bound by those grand jury secrecy rules, as are the grand jurors themselves. They're not permitted to talk about the evidence they hear in the setting of a grand jury hearing. And the police, the investigators, the agents, the detectives, they're not permitted to breathe a word of what's going on before the grand jury. You know who's not bound by the grand jury secrecy rules? The witnesses. The witnesses are not prohibited from talking with reporters, with their friends, with their family, with media, with anybody about what goes on inside the grand jury. Now, we always instructed our grand jury witnesses, look, you're not prohibited from talking about what goes on in the grand jury, but we would urge you not to talk about it. No good can come of it, and it could impede our ongoing investigation. So we respectfully asked our witnesses not to talk about what went on in the grand jury, but there was no prohibition. They weren't violating any rule if they went to the Washington Post and said, let me tell you what the prosecutors are asking me about Donald Trump. And it seems like some of those witnesses are now doing that, talking to Carol Leonnig and perhaps others at the Washington Post or elsewhere. And let me say one more thing before we move on to the next data point. With witnesses appearing before the federal grand jury like Mark Short, Mike Pence's chief of staff, and Greg Jacob, one of Mike Pence's top advisors, legal advisors, do you think those witnesses are going to have any interest in covering up the crimes of Donald Trump? Or do you think their loyalties will reside with their boss, Mike Pence? After all, Donald Trump set Mike Pence up to be hurt. In fact, Donald Trump expressly said that he agreed with his angry mob that Mike Pence should be hanged. So I suspect the testimony of Mark Short and Greg Jacob probably didn't help Donald Trump much. That's just my speculation. Let's move on to another data point. We learned in that same Washington Post reporting that federal grand jury subpoenas have been issued to some of the state legislators that were subjected to Trump and company's pressure campaign, trying to get them to appoint fake electors to try to unlawfully undermine Joe Biden's election win. And the subpoenas that are going out to, for example, some of the state legislators in Arizona are demanding, requiring the production of the following information. All documents and communications to, from, and with any member, employee, or agent of Donald J. Trump. Ouch. And before we move on to another data point, the subpoenas that are going out to the Arizona state legislators also reinforce what we were just talking about, how grand jury secrecy rules apply to everybody except the witnesses. Here's some of the language from one of the subpoenas that went out to one of the Arizona state legislators. Although you are not required to do so, you are requested not to disclose the existence of this subpoena. Any such disclosure could impede the investigation being conducted and thereby interfere with the enforcement of the law. So that's just an example of how prosecutors ask witnesses not to disclose what goes on before the grand jury, but they can't prohibit witnesses from talking about their testimony before the grand jury. Let's do just one more really good data point that comes out of the same Washington Post reporting. Quote, Justice Department investigators in April received phone records of key officials and aides in the Trump administration, including former Chief of Staff Mark Meadows, according to two people familiar with the matter. That effort is another indicator of how expansive the January 6 probe had become well before the high-profile televised House hearings in June and July on the subject. Let's unpack that, because that is a really good data point. Back in April, it looks like the Department of Justice subpoenaed phone records for Mark Meadows and other members of the Trump administration, and we knew nothing about it. It wasn't publicly disclosed. There was no reporting about it. That just reaffirms and reinforces that the Department of Justice has been digging into a criminal investigation in ways and at times we knew nothing about. That is a good sign for accountability. And let me leave you with this, friends. Who was it that Mark Meadows was talking to and texting with a whole lot about trying to overturn the results of the presidential election? Ginni Thomas, wife of Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas. So now that we know the Department of Justice, the federal criminal investigation, has had Mark Meadows' phone records since at least April, I decided I would tweet a little something out earlier today about the implications for Ginni Thomas about that revelation that DOJ has Mark Meadows' phone records. Federal prosecutors have the phone records of Mark Meadows. Ginni Thomas might now want to be less concerned about a J6 committee subpoena and more concerned about the inevitable federal grand jury subpoena. So justice may not come only for Donald Trump, may end up coming for Ginni Thomas as well. And that's a good thing, because justice matters. It's heating up, friends. You know, I think we may just get there after all. As always, please stay safe, please stay tuned, and I look forward to talking with you all again tomorrow.